Pokemon Sword and Shield are games that garnered much debate online leading up to their launch. People were either tearing the game apart based on what they saw in the trailers, with graphics and animations coming under the most fire, or defending their games and their creator. There was the fiasco involving the tree that looks like it came straight out of Ocarina of Time for the N64.
Really fuck with me way back then, girl. How about it? 'Cause I'm up right now.
And a lot of what I think is valid criticism for Pokemon battle animations. Not to mention the absolute disaster, the mountain made out of a molehill that was the removal of the national dex. But I'll get more into that later. It was around this time that I and a lot of people started realizing that Game Freak aren't fantastic modern developers. Having developed nothing but handheld Pokemon games up to this point has definitely hid some of their weaknesses as developers. Don't get me wrong, Game Freak has made some of my most favorite games of all time, but there's no denying that developing those games wasn't very difficult, or nearly as difficult as developing a game for modern hardware like the Switch. Earlier this year, I made a video discussing my hopes for Pokemon 2019, and Pokemon 2019 is here, and boy do I have a lot of thoughts. In this video, I'll be offering up a comprehensive review, then look at how Sword and Shield stood up against my expectations I set forth in that video. The first thing I'll be looking at in the game is the visuals, as they are the most criticized and debated aspect leading up to the release. Firstly, I must say I was quite impressed by some aspects of the world. The first shot of the game as you leave your house was pretty stunning, with lots of vibrant colors and pretty lighting, not to mention the opening cinematic displaying a large stadium with smoothly animated crowds and characters. The Pokemon look fantastic also, and the spectacle that comes with the Gigantamax battles, a new mechanic that makes your Pokemon gigantic, is very enjoyable. It's hard to say if the simplistic art style was a deliberate choice by the developers or one made to cut costs. Whatever the reason for the simple, low-detailed textures, it certainly does not push the capabilities of the Switch like I and many others were hoping for. This isn't to say I don't appreciate the graphical style the game's achieved. I think it fits pretty well with the established artistic direction of Pokemon as a franchise. It certainly lends itself to some good environments, but at other times, like the wild area, things just don't look good. The colors, like the vibrancy found in other areas of the game, and the wide open spaces make the subpar ground textures stick straight out. And yeah, the trees are super scuffed and hard to look at. It is also worth noting that pop-ins are abundant, which I think is inexcusable. But overall, the game isn't by any means ugly. It has its highs and lows in what terms of you'll be saying, but I'd say it's quite easy on the eyes. Nothing as bad as everyone was criticizing the games about before they came out. Moving on to talking about animations though is a whole different story. There is a ton of buzz surrounding what some of the animations in the game look like, and a lot of criticism. Some I still agree with after playing the games. Battle animations are laughably lazy at times. Many moves involve the Pokemon either hopping or moving side to side, without their model actually doing anything. They just stand statically as they are lifted and pulled around the screen. One example of this poor level of quality was apparent when I evolved my starter, Grookey, into Thwackey. It was a cool Pokemon, I loved the way it looked, and it got the move Double Hit after it finished evolving. So I sent it out into battle and used Double Hit, expecting to see my cool new Pokemon swing around the sticks it was holding. But all I got was the model hopping up and down with the move effect playing out on the opposing Pokemon. I am just so confused as to why Game Freak didn't set the move to play Thwackey's attack animation. Every Pokemon has at least 2 unique attacking animations that their model performs, but many moves fail to utilize them. The games lack turning around animations for the overworld also, which is also just bad and funny. There was a clip I saw going around before the games came out of Zacian, the Sword Box legendary, turning around that just made me so disappointed in the games. Overworld animations are, for the most part, really plain and not good. During scenes where characters are talking, it's a lot of those not animated turns and very simple emotes. I only criticize these kinds of scenes because of how well animated some of the cutscenes are. Pierre, the Dark-type gym leader, has so much fluid motion and character put into his animations and the way he moves and emotes. Leon and Chairman Rose are other good examples as well, so it doesn't make any sense to me why there are such good animations in some scenarios, on some characters, and not on others. But hey, it's a Pokemon game. I personally am not playing for the graphics, though I would have really liked to have my mind blown by the jump from 3DS to Switch. And a lot of the complaints I saw online, texture quality, pop-ins, animation quality, are certainly valid and things that should have been given more time. Another aspect of the game that I want to touch on briefly is the music. because I think music is an important part of any game. And the music is good, with lots of standout bangers like Marnie's battle theme, Bede's theme, the Battle Tower theme, and Motostoke. The normal wild Pokemon battle theme, which players will likely hear the most, is pretty good also, nice and catchy and upbeat. The instruments used throughout the game aren't great, there's lots of bells and synth that I don't love, but the tracks made pretty good use of them. Motostoke has this really cool sax part that I love, and it really stands out. So yeah, music's good if that's important to you. The last thing I'll be looking at before the gameplay is the story. I understand story in a Pokemon game is important to some people, but I'm really not one of those people, and I'm going to do my best to speak on their behalf. A story in the traditional sense of Pokemon is barely present, with an evil team and the fate of the world and all that. Team Yell, what people thought was going to be the evil team, is kind of a joke. I don't want to spoil anything, but just know that they're stupid. The only thing with stakes that happens at the very end of the game, right before you're supposed to challenge the champion, but it is a pretty cool finale with lots of spectacle. There's no evil team involved with the story, so what is the story like? Well, it all centers around the gym challenge, which I actually really like. In the Galar region, gyms are these massive events on huge fields inside arenas filled with spectators. The champion is a central character and is the older brother of your rival Hop. Other challengers of the gym challenge are your rivals, and you will periodically run into them before meeting them in the finals. All these characters are pretty damn good for Pokemon standards, a game series that's never had very good or memorable characters, specifically recently. All the X and Y rivals were very one-sided and forgettable, and How was just ugh, I hate How. But Hop is a real step up, with real motivation and a real struggle to set himself apart from his brother and live up to his expectations. Bede is possibly my favorite character in all of Pokemon. He's just this cold, salty bitch with a god complex because he got endorsed by the league chairman. He never wastes an opportunity to just be an asshole to the player character in Hop, even though I absolutely decimated him in every fight. I just loved how salty and blatantly disrespectful he was at every turn of the game, even though the game meant for you to hate him. Without saying anything, he does undergo some character growth that is quite interesting to see unfold. There are some more good characters. A lot of people seem to really like Sonya for her character, I'm sure, but Hop and Bede are the ones that stick out to me the most. So altogether, the story is all about the gym challenge this time around, in case you're expecting the usual evil team plot, but I quite enjoyed it. It felt like I was playing through a tournament arc in an anime. I've been watching a lot of My Hero Academia lately. And the characters are great, some of the best in the whole series. So lastly, and most extensively, I'm going to take a look at the raw gameplay of Sword and Shield. The games keep the established trend set in Sun and Moon, in which battling is de-emphasized and de-incentivized, and catching Pokemon and filling your Pokedex is where most of the gameplay comes from. Also included is the addition of the wild area, and with it max raid battles. But firstly, I'm going to examine some of the changes, or de-incentives, that make battling and raising a team less rewarding in these games. The first is the incorporation of shared EXP across your party. We first saw this in X and Y in the form of the EXP share item that players could toggle on and off, then again in Sun and Moon, and now it is fully incorporated in the game, not even as an item, with players having no way of turning it off. The most annoying thing this item does is that it doesn't require you to use all of your team members, and players can have a good or bad way of looking at it. On one hand, I loved in older games using each Pokemon in my party evenly and giving them each fair share of time in battle, and keeping each around the same level. But in Sword and Shield, you can go the entire game using only one Pokemon in battle, and your party will all level up using only that one Pokemon. In my playthrough of the game, I had a Rookity and its evolutions on my team for a good portion of the game, up until about the 4th gym. I almost never used this Pokemon in battle. For the most part, it just sat in my party not doing anything, just feeding off the experience earned by my other Pokemon. Raising this Pokemon wasn't fun or satisfying, it just felt like work and only a matter of time before it fully evolved without doing anything. There's something deeply satisfying in the older games when I would take an underleveled Pokemon, use it a lot, and send it into battle with hopes of it gaining levels, until it was finally strong enough to stand with the rest of my team. Also in my playthrough, I went from about levels 10 to 25, almost always using nothing but Dottler as my main guy, always at the front of the party, always doing all the work, and my entire rest of the team benefited almost as much as he did from the experience in battle. You could argue that I was playing the game wrong, and I could have just sent out any other Pokemon from my party for the fun of it, but there was no incentive for me to do that if they were all just going to be evenly leveled no matter what. The game does not incentivize or even require you to shift around your team and battle with less used mons like in the older games. Putting all of this aside, and possibly the biggest grievance one could have with shared XP is just how easy the game is due to its inclusion. Once I had established a main team of 6 members, it did not take long for each of them to grow up to 10 levels or higher than other trainers and even gym leaders Pokemon. The game is an utter cakewalk, there's no getting around that, but the EXP sharing is only part of it. Much is also owed to the very weak trainers and wild Pokemon you're able to catch at very high levels. On the other hand, however, in defense of shared EXP, it's kind of a necessary change for the shift of gameplay into catching and Pokédex completion. If your main goal in Sword and Shield is to go through the game and catch every Pokemon, then battles and raising a team will not be your number one priority. Your priority is going to be obtaining all the Pokemon. What the EXP share does is get rid of the tedium these types of players experience in the older games. Why waste your time training each individual Pokemon in order to do well in the gym challenge or get the evolutions registered in the dex when the game does it for you? This brings me to my next point, and that is the addition of being able to catch almost every Pokemon, even fully evolved ones out in the wild with relative ease. This addition is another one that de-incentivizes battling. In older games, it was very rewarding to grind up your team and evolve each one into more powerful monsters that you couldn't get any other way than by battling and raising their levels or by some other means. In these games, however, getting that final evolution that you worked so long and hard for is immediately undermined as soon as you run into that final evolution in the wild. Why raise a team when you can just catch any post-game party members at the very end of the game where they are all fully evolved and easily captured? So raising a team is no longer the focus of the minute-to-minute gameplay of Sword and Shield. So is catching Pokemon fun? Yes, but also no. The game boasts an intuitive and much more interesting, convenient new encounter system. The way it works is, inside patches of grass, which should be a familiar sight to veteran players, there are Pokemon models roaming in the overworld. Running into these overworld models initiates an encounter. Additionally, parts of grass will rustle on occasion with an exclamation point signaling that there is a random Pokemon in that location. Running into this rustling patch will initiate an encounter with a random mystery Pokemon. You can avoid every encounter with relative ease if you tried. There are no forced random encounters while you walk through the grass, caves, or bike across water. Every encounter is clearly visible and avoidable. Not only does this make the game far less annoying, but spotting a Pokemon you have yet to register in your dex, then simply running up to it is so nice and convenient. No longer do you have to walk back and forth in a patch of grass waiting for a random encounter to occur so you can maybe find the Pokemon you're looking for. In Sword and Shield, encountering a Pokemon is usually as easy as spotting it in the overworld. There are some Pokemon, however, that have very low spawn rates in the overworld, and are easier to find in random rustling grass, which are very annoying to find, but they are a rare case, and the tedium that comes with finding them is certainly outweighed by the convenience of catching all the others. The actual act of capturing Pokemon, throwing a Pokeball, is still the same as it's ever been in older games, which isn't to say it's bad, but it's definitely uninteresting. Last year's release of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee saw the introduction of a new capturing system, a kind of minigame similar to the one found in Pokemon Go. Many people, myself included, didn't like the idea of this new system one bit, but eventually I realized that it's a much more engaging and interesting method than simply mashing A through a menu and hoping for the best. Some may argue that it is fun to strategize around lowering a Pokemon's health before catching, but that always seemed like a waste of time to me during my time with Sword and Shield. My main way of going about catching a Pokemon was encountering it, then just throwing balls until it was caught. I would much prefer a more engaging method of capturing, of sorts that Let's Go featured. One of my biggest criticisms of Sun and Moon in my past video was for the game's habit of confining players to short, cramped routes in which free exploration is stifled by linearity. Pokemon Sword and Shield bucked this trend that I saw becoming a problem with the featuring of the Wild Area. The Wild Area is an enormous, sprawling location in which players are free to encounter and capture nearly any Pokemon in the game at any time. A Pokemon level capture cap was introduced so players can't catch OP Mons for where they are in the story, meaning battling higher level Pokemon isn't locked behind progress walls, and players are free to battle insanely higher monsters just for the challenge of it. I was so excited when I wandered into a portion of the Wild Area that just contained some monstrously high-level Ice-type Pokemon compared to my team. I felt weak in comparison, and it made me want to train and progress through the story, so I was able to challenge them. It was so easy to spend hours just biking around the giant map and picking up Pokemon for my decks, and this fun, exploration-based system of finding new mons for my decks was part of the reason I enjoyed filling it out so much in this game. Along with catching and fighting mons you find roaming the map, you can challenge Dynamax Pokemon in raid battles. Scattered throughout the world are what are called dens, which sometimes can emit a beacon of light signaling to players that they are able to challenge a giant Pokemon to a battle, and earn rewards from defeating it, as well as getting a chance to capture it. Up to 3 additional players can be invited to a max raid, either via local or online communication, a feature me and my friends made the absolute most of. Raids start out easy at the beginning of the game, but as you go deeper and the number of stars on a raid increases, things get pretty intense, with the enemy Pokemon putting up barriers and thwarting off status changes. This is when the horrible NPC AI really starts to show. You'll get a Magikarp on your team, or a Solrock that does nothing but use cosmic power, and it's really frustrating. So if you really want to take the raid seriously, getting some friends together is the only real viable option. So overall, looking at gameplay, it really depends on whether or not you like the catching or battling aspects of Pokemon games. Me personally, I was all about battling, but this game more or less converted me to this new gameplay style, and I'm definitely okay with this being the direction the series goes from here. Max raids in the wild area were always a blast as well, so did I have fun playing the games? Certainly. Do I like the games, and do I have a respect for them, at least to a degree as much as past games? Well, I think this is just something I'm going to have to get used to, the fact that newer Pokemon games will never be the same as the older ones. X and Y and Sun and Moon struggled to get me on board with this new era of Pokemon, with Sword and Shield doing a much better job. With time, I think I'll grow the same sort of fondness for post-3DS era Pokemon as pre-3DS era. It took some time to get used to, but the new gameplay loop involving catching Pokemon in the wild area and along routes, as opposed to battling through routes, is something I enjoyed. If you were dead set in your ways like I was, and only enjoyed Pokemon games solely for the battles, give these games a fair shot. I'm sure you'll enjoy them as much as I did. So that was my review of the games, but there are still some final points I'd like to bring up, those being things that either lived up to or failed to meet my expectations set forth in my hopes for Pokemon 2019. Our first hope for an upcoming game was more interesting or higher fidelity graphics. I criticized Let's Go for not taking any risks and just looking like an up-resed Sun and Moon. Sad to say, Sword and Shield's graphics hardly set themselves apart, and the environments aren't even interesting as Sun and Moon's. I really didn't give enough credit to Sun and Moon for having some really diverse and unique areas, tropical islands, jungles, beaches, high-tech labs, and literal other dimensions are all there, with Sword and Shield toting just as much variety as X and Y, which is not very much. Another hope of mine in the graphics department was a camera placed behind the player character, and though this is only in the wild area, Game Freak delivered with a fully controllable camera that you can use to view all of those wide open locales however you please. Though locked to a certain area, it is certainly the best area for it. In order for Game Freak to take this camera into every game area, they would have to open up and widen every town and route, of which in Sword and Shield can be just as confining as Sun and Moon. There are some more open routes for sure, but some are just tight and short, and towns that are just tiny. Just look at Hammerlock. It's supposed to be this giant city that powers the entire region of Galar, but all it is one street that you can walk down, east or west. My hope for the future is that Game Freak opens these shorter areas up so they can accommodate for the wild area's freely controllable camera. My next hope mentioned in the My Hopes video was for the games to contain less Pokemon. Now the regional Galar Pokedex is sitting at 400 Mons, but there is no national dex, meaning those 400 native to the game are the only ones you can catch. Now, there was a ton of controversy over people not having their favorite Pokemon in the new games, and just over the games not having all the Pokemon, but I really couldn't care less about any of this. The way I look at it is that it makes things easier for completion. If you wanted to complete the national dex in Sun and Moon, you have to do an insane amount of finagling Pokemon from older games with transferring and all that. But in these games, it's all right here, which I find really nice. I've come around to the larger regional dex also. Had it been only around 200 Pokemon like in Platinum, it would have taken no time at all to complete with how available evolved Pokemon are, so I can appreciate a larger number of mons to collect. Me, I'm still working towards that ultimate goal. My dex right now sitting about 275 with about 40 hours in the game. So yeah, bigger dex makes completing it a bigger reward, and with the improvements to ease of finding and catching Pokemon, it's not as tiresome. What I do have a problem with is again the lack of new Pokemon. We only got 80 this time around, which is bad enough, but then I take into account the obligatory 9 starters, 3 legendaries, 3 rodents, and 3 birds. I realize there are only about 60 completely original new designs, so yeah, that's an L. I mean, Gen 2 brought about 100 new monsters, Gen 3 135, 4 106, and Gen 5 with a whopping 156, just shy of double of what Sword and Shield introduced. One could argue that Game Freak is literally running out of ideas for new Pokemon, but each new design in these games is just great, I think. People continue to say that and make that argument, but they've proved to us time and time again that they still have great ideas for Pokemon. Seriously, there are some fantastic Pokemon this time around. My only wish is that I got to see more of what Game Freak had to offer this generation. Another complaint I had about Sun and Moon that I hope they would fix in the next games were how handholdy and intrusive the games and its characters were. I think I can say to a degree of certainty that characters are much less annoying. This might be owed to how much time I spent in the wild area between towns, but regardless, I like the characters much more than in any other game, and I hope I made that abundantly clear earlier in this video. Difficulty was another thing I hoped Game Freak would fix, and they didn't. The games are possibly the easiest they've ever been, with my team being so high, up to 15 levels higher than Gym Leaders' Pokemon. Along with the EXP share, this could be owed to the wild area as well, as XP candies you get from raids help level your Pokemon up a shit ton, but I think steeper level scaling would still help the games be more fun. A lack of general openness was another criticism I brought up. I mostly attacked Sun and Moon's short routes in small areas that don't give players much room to roam. Obviously, the wild area completely decimates in this category. I've already talked about that, but there are also some nice open routes like Route 9 and Route 4, but there are also some pretty short routes that let me down. Route 6 is short, the caves are really straightforward and linear, and caves in Pokemon were rarely ever straightforward at all before X and Y, but there were certainly steps forward that I appreciate. The very last hope that I discussed in my video was for Game Freak to take more risks with their new games, and well, the wild area and max raid battles are like nothing we've ever seen before in a Pokemon game. They are completely new and original innovations that I love. I hope we see more of these mechanics specifically, but I also hope new innovations like this come about. So big props to Game Freak for taking risks and making big moves. So those are all my thoughts on Pokemon Sword and Shield for the Nintendo Switch. Overall, I definitely came out way more optimistic for the series than I was earlier this year, and I just hope Game Freak keeps taking those steps in the right direction. Thanks so much for watching the video. I put a ton of work into writing this, and leave me a comment so we can get some discussion going. See ya.